Assalamu alaikum ji. I am your instructor and we are into the 17th lecture on history and systems of psychology. I hope you are doing your revisions. I hope you are looking at the internet and are correcting your pronunciation of the proper nouns. जो लोगों के हम नाम लेते रहे हैं, आप उनको सही तौर पर प्रोनाउंस करते रहे होंगे. And I hope that you have been able to see the connection that one has been trying to point out to you. In the past few lectures, as you obviously have noticed, we have gone more and more into development of psychology in various schools. We talked about the structuralist school, and then we talked about, in the last lectures, this functionalist school. The structuralists were interested in finding the structure of consciousness. Their main area of interest in psychology was the structure of the consciousness, and the functionalists were interested in seeing how consciousness operates, how it functions. And because of their approaches, later historians have called those people structuralists and these people functionalists. पिछली दफ़े हमने कुछ यूरोपियन फंक्शनलिस्ट्स का जिक्र किया था. आज हम एक और स्कूल का जिक्र करेंगे, लेकिन उससे पहले let us revise what we did the last time. That is lecture number 16. We were talking about functionalists, and in that context we had divided functionalism into the American contribution and the European contributions. And we talked about two prominent American contributors, and then we talked about three important, prominent European contributors. Last time we talked about three European contributors to functionalism. Can you remember their names, and can you revise, bring to your mind what we talked about? The first functionalist that we talked about the last time, which belonged to Europe, was David Katz, a Swedish functionalist. The other functionalist that we talked about was a Dutch. Is that right? Somebody who belongs to, who works in Holland, is a Dutch. And he, the functionalist that we talked about, was in Copenhagen, which is Holland. And his name was Edgar Reuben. And the third functionalist that we talked about was a Swiss psychologist, and he was, can you recall his name? Jean Piaget. First, one small contribution of David Katz's. Of course, his is a lot of impact. His contribution left a lot of impact. But from the historical point of view, when I say a small point, that is from a historical point of view, and that was that he discovered, he saw the phenomena of, do you remember what? Color constancy. That we have a tendency to see colors in the similar fashion regardless of what kind of light is being reflected. Although, as I explained, the nature of light that is reflected from a colored object influences our perception of the color, such that natural light as contrasted to artificial light, सूरज की रोशनी और बिजली की रोशनी, ये दो मुख्तलिफ किस्म की रोशनियां हैं. एक चीज का रंग सूरज की रोशनी में और तरह का दिखाई देता है और दूसरी उसी चीज का रंग दूसरी लाइट में और तरह का दिखाई देता है. बट डेविड कार्ड्स हैड डिस्कवर्ड that we tend to see these two colors or these colors in a constant manner, and that is one of the functions of consciousness that he talks about, and on the basis of that we include him as one of the prominent functionalists. The other functionalist that we talked about was, as I said, Edgar Rubin, and he is considered a functionalist or included in the functionalist school because he elaborated the concept of figure and ground. Now, what is this figure and ground? Figure and ground is when you see clouds against the sky. Clouds are a figure and the sky is the ground. When you see the moon, then clouds or sky is the ground and moon is the figure. When you see a tree, then of course the clouds become the ground and the tree becomes a figure. When you look at a tree, a branch becomes the figure and the tree is the ground. When you look at the branch, then of course the leaf on that branch or a fruit on that branch would be a figure and the branch would be the ground. So this is how figure and ground relationship continues, that our perception, Rubin points out, is always in terms of figure and ground. And that is an important contribution of Rubin's, and because he talks about, elaborates this function of consciousness, he is grouped in the functionalist school or the European functionalist school. And the third person that we talked about in that regard was, as you remember, a very important Swiss psychologist, and his name was, recollect? Yes, that's right, Jean Piaget. Please remember the correct pronunciation. Jean, J-E-A-N, as you have seen it on your television screens also. Jean Piaget, P-I-A-G-E-T, Jean Piaget. And what does Jean Piaget has to say about functions of our psychology or functions of consciousness? He talked about schemata, that children have an image, an idea, a construct, a picture, a diagram of the world outside, and that he calls a schemata or a schema. The schemata or the schema is the image of how the world is for a child. And he said that the schemata changes due to two factors or two operations: assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is when new things are absorbed into the schemata, new ideas, new variables, new pieces of information, new elements are added to the schemata. And the schemata also changes because of accommodation. Because of these additions that take place, the schemata changes. The schemata becomes different in terms of its structure. It enlarges, it changes its shape, it changes its figure. That is to accommodate जो इंफॉर्मेशन रिसीव हो रही है असिमिलेशन के जरिए, उसको अपने अंदर रखने के लिए स्कीमेटा को, हमारी स्कीम ऑफ थिंग्स को अपनी शेप बदलनी है. एंड दैट इज व्हाट इज कॉल्ड अकोमोडेशन बाय जॉन पियाजे. The other important thing that Jean Piaget talked about was that children develop in 4 stages. And what were those 4 stages? The first and primary stage of development of a child is what he calls the sensory motor stage, where children learn or assimilate and accommodate, where schemata grows or changes its shape as a result of receiving sensations, as a result of usage of sense organs. The second stage of development in children, according to Piaget, is what he calls the pre-operational stage, जहां पर अभी तक बच्चों के सोच के अंदाज, उनकी लॉजिक, उनकी रीजनिंग अभी तक बहुत बढ़ी नहीं, डेवलप नहीं हुई. But reasoning in its rudimentary form has appeared, and that is what he calls the pre-operational stage. And the third stage is what he calls the concrete operational stage, where reason and logic have developed to a fairly high degree, where the children or the adolescents can reason fairly well, and by reason and by logic they assimilate and accommodate and change the schemata. And that is the third stage of development of children. And the fourth and the final stage, in Piaget's point of view, is what he calls the formal operational stage, where thinking has developed in a most highly sophisticated manner, where abstract reasoning has appeared, where an adolescent, an adult or a child does not have to go back and look at things in the most raw forms, where he can manipulate images in his mind and discover new things. And that is what he calls the formal operational stage. Now, these were the 4 stages, and these were the 3 people that we talked about in relation to functionalism in the last lecture. Let us go a little forward and take a look at the beginning of another school. And the other school, as you can see on your screens, behaviorism. Before we formally go into description of behaviorism, let us first see the background of how behaviorism came into being. और इससे पहले कि हम ये जाने कि behaviorism है क्या, उसकी थोड़ी सी उसके खद्दो खाल पे भी नज़र रखते हैं और उसकी बैकग्राउंड भी देखते हैं. If you remember, we are into the late 19th and the early 20th century now. Industrial revolution had taken place, and as a result of industrial revolution, European and American continents are industrialized. More and more labor is being transferred to machines. Transportation has become, communication has become extremely rapid. Industry is expanding at a lightning speed, velocity. जिसका मतलब ये है कि यूरोपियन कॉन्टिनेंट पे और नॉर्थ अमेरिकन कॉन्टिनेंट में जहां इंडस्ट्रियलाइजेशन का बूम आया है, वहां पर इंडस्ट्री को आगे बढ़ाने के लिए इस बात की जरूरत है कि इंडस्ट्री में जो ह्यूमन बीइंग्स एम्प्लॉयड हैं वो प्रॉपर तरह से इंडस्ट्री को ऑपरेट कर सकें। अगर वो प्रॉपर तरह से इंडस्ट्री को ऑपरेट कर रहे हैं तो फिर इंडस्ट्री बढ़ेगी, फिर ज्यादा से ज्यादा इंडस्ट्री के फवायद लोगों को पहुंचेंगे और लोगों की जिंदगियों में आसूदगी आएगी। कुछ प्रॉब्लम्स भी आएंगे लेकिन आसूदगियां भी आएंगी। तो इंडस्ट्रियल रेवोल्यूशन का एक असर ये था कि ह्यूमन बिहेवियर को समझना, कंट्रोल करना और प्रिडिक्ट करना निहायत जरूरी हो गया था। इस स्टेज पे डेवलपमेंट थी कि हमें इंसान के किरदार को जल्द से जल्द समझ के उसको कंट्रोल करने की जरूरत थी। ये एक बिहेवियरिज्म के या लेट 19th सेंचुरी या अर्ली 20th सेंचुरी की डिमांड थी, और इस डिमांड को अगर आप मद्देनजर रखेंगे तो फिर आपको बिहेवियरिज्म की बैकग्राउंड में समझने में आसानी होगी। इसी बिना पे कि इंसान को जल्द से जल्द कैसे समझा जाए, बड़े बड़े लोगों ने तजुर्बात शुरू किए थे, और इनमें एक अहम तजुर्बाकार जो है जिसको हम अब बिहेवियरिज्म के जुमरे में शामिल करते हैं, उसका नाम था थॉर्नडाइक। जैसा कि आप अपनी टेलीविजन की स्क्रीन पर भी देखेंगे, एडवर्ड ली थॉर्नडाइक, who was born in 1874 and who died in 1949. He worked at the Harvard University. He had read all of William James's contribution to psychology. He was very impressed with William James's point of view that consciousness has a definite function, and that definite function is to allow a person to get adjusted to his environment. Remember, that is what James had said. He had said that consciousness is not an epiphenomena, यूं ही नहीं है, बल्कि उसका एक मकसद है, और वो मकसद है कि हमारा शऊर हमें अपने इर्द गिर्द के हालात से मुताबिकत पैदा करने का एक जरिया है। That is what William James had said. Thorndike was impressed with this. Thorndike had also noted Pavlovian experiments. He had read about Pavlov. Do you remember who was Pavlov? Yes, Pavlov was a Russian physiologist, psychologist. Do you remember what is the difference between a Russian physiologist, psychologist and a Soviet physiologist, psychologist? We will talk about Soviet psychologists later also, but do you remember? Prior to 1917, 1917 से पहले जो रूस का अब इलाका है वो रशिया कहलाता था। 1917 के बाद एक सियासी जमात ने जब इक़्तिदार पे कब्जा किया तो वो रूस का इलाका और कुछ इलाकों में मदगम हुआ, and they formulated a state which they called the Soviet Union. And then, if you remember, in the 90s, the Soviet Union again separated and became separate independent country. So today we still call Russia, which had become part of the Soviet Union. Now, Pavlov was a Russian physiologist because we are talking of the time prior to 1917. 1917 से पहले की बात कर रहे हैं। और आपको याद है पेवलॉव की क्या कंट्रीब्यूशन थी? क्यों पेवलॉव को इतना अहम नाम समझा जाता है? इसलिए कि पेवलॉव ने he had discovered the laws of conditioning. Do you remember what are the laws of conditioning? Do you remember what is conditioning? Conditioning is when we associate two stimuli, and two stimuli presented together lead to a response. Remember that? He had said that two stimuli, when they are presented together, elicit a response, and when you withdraw one stimulus, the response still remains, and that is how organisms learn. Do you remember his laws of learning? His laws of learning were reinforcement, quickly to recapture what we had done, extinction, generalization, discrimination, and spontaneous recovery. आपको याद हैं सारे वो? चलिए, keep that in mind and let us see what Thorndike was doing, who was an American and born later, died later than Pavlov. Pavlov had done his experiments on dogs, whereas Thorndike did his experiments first with chicks, छोटे चूजों के साथ, then with fish, then with cats, then with monkeys, but his famous experiments were done with cats. And those experiments that he did with cats were done in the laboratory that William James had set up. एक आपको टिटबिट भी सुना दूं इसके बारे में, that Thorndike, while doing his experiments, had moved to William James's house, his home, and he occupied a room in William James's house. उनके घर में रहते रहे वो, और अपने कुछ तजुर्बात जो बिल्लियों पे उन्होंने किए वो विलियम जेम्स के घर में रहते हुए किए थे. It's just a little tidbit that I thought I'd just put across to you. Now, let us look at Thorndike's experiments. And what did he do? He devised what is today called a puzzle box. A puzzle box doing experiments with cats. वो puzzle box क्या था? एक पिंजरा, उसका एक दरवाजा, और दरवाजे के आगे एक कुंडी. That's all. और वो कुंडी इस तरह की थी और वो पिंजरा इस तरह का था that a cat, once if it was put into that cage, could take its paws, अपने पंजे उस पिंजरे से बाहर निकाल के उस पिंजरे के इर्द गिर्द को टच कर सकती थी. वो इस तरह का वो पिंजरा था. The cat could also manipulate, could play with the kundi, the clip with which the door of the cage was locked. समझ में आ रही है आपकी बात? We are talking about a puzzle box which was a cage made with a type of a net, metallic net, through which there was a door, and on the door there was a clip, and Thorndike would put the cat into that cage and put the door up and clip it and lock the door. ताला नहीं लगाते थे बल्कि उसकी कुंडी बंद कर देते थे. But that clip could be manipulated, could be used, could be played by the cat, and that was the puzzle box. अब उन्होंने क्या किया? He kept a cat hungry for some hours, then put the cat into the puzzle box, and then locked the puzzle box, and then put some food outside of the puzzle box. What do you think the cat would do? If the cat is hungry, what do you expect the cat to do? The cat, of course, can see the food out there. So what is the cat going to do? The cat is going to try and escape from the puzzle box so that the cat could reach the food, so that the cat could eat the food. And that is exactly what the cat did. But the cat could not escape because there was a door and the door was latched with a clip. So what did the cat do? It tried to manipulate the catch, the clip, so that it could open the door and get out. It played with the latch. It played with that clip for some time, and accidentally it pulled it down and it opened the door by itself. And soon as the cat opened the door, it could come out and eat the food. This is how the sequence of event took place. Thorndike repeated the same procedure a number of times, and he saw that whenever he let the cat go without food and then put the cat in the puzzle box and then latched or clipped the puzzle box, the cat learned to play with the latch, play with the lock, play with the clip, unleash, open the door by itself, get out of the cage and eat the food. And that is how a cat in Thorndike's experiment learned. How? By trying to open the door, by trying to manipulate the latch, and then learning to open it by itself, and then be able to get out, and then eat the food. Now, this is how Thorndike saw the cat's learning. Based upon his experiments, he formulated what he called the laws of learning. And the laws of learning were, if you compare the laws of learning that Thorndike formulated with the laws of learning that Pavlov had enumerated, had discovered, then you would see that there is some similarity between these two. Okay? What are Thorndike's laws of learning? The first law of learning was what he called the law of effect. And what is the law of effect? As I said, see its relationship with Pavlovian laws of conditioning. The law of effect, as propounded by Thorndike, was that those responses in the cats which were followed by reinforcement were stamped in. Law of effect is that learning becomes a part of the organism because certain responses are positively reinforced, are rewarded. अब अगर उसका पैराडाइम देखें, उसका एक्सपेरिमेंटल डिज़ाइन देखें, उसका तरीक़ाकार देखें, थॉर्नडाइक का तो क्या था? एक बिल्ली को पिंजरे में बंद किया, उसको भूखा रखा और उसको पिंजरे में बंद करने के बाद पिंजरे के बाहर फूड, खुराक मुहैया की गई और बिल्ली जो है उसको इस बात की आज़ादी थी कि वो उस पिंजरे में पाँव मारे और पाँव के ज़रिए से, पाँव के ज़रिए से उसके लीवर्स को छेड़े और अगर लीवर दब जाए तो दरवाज़ा खुल जाए और बिल्ली बाहर आके खाना खा ले. खाना खाना would be what? In psychological scientific terms, that would be reinforcement. Thorndike formulated the law. He said cats, animals, and then of course human beings also learn as a result of law of effect. Those responses which are rewarded, which lead to satisfaction, are learned, are stamped in the organism. and those responses that are not satisfied or that don't bring satisfaction are stamped out. अब इस बिल्ली के तजर्बे में कौन सी रिस्पॉन्सेज थी जो स्टैम्प इन हुई? वो रिस्पॉन्सेज जिसके जरिए से बिल्ली ने पंजे की मदद, अपने पंजे से लैच को दबाया, लैच को खोला, ताले को खोला, कुंडी को खोला और बाहर आके खाना खा लिया. अगर बिल्ली ने अपने कानों को प्रिक किया या अपने किसी जिस्म के हिस्से को उसने चाटा तो उसकी वजह से उसको फूड नहीं मिला, इसलिए उसने वो रिस्पॉन्सेज लर्न नहीं की और बिल्ली ने वो रिस्पॉन्सेज लर्न की जिसके जरिए से उसको सेटिस्फैक्शन मिली ऑफ इट्स हंगर. And that is what Thorndike is saying, that only those responses which lead to satisfaction, which lead to enjoyment, which lead to lessening of tension in the body are stamped in, and those responses which do not lead to this. बिल्ली ने और भी बहुत सी चीजें की होंगी केज में. Those that were not followed by satisfaction were not stamped in. And that is how Thorndike showed cats learned by the operation of the law of effect. Those responses are learned, are reinforced, which follow by satisfaction, which are followed by satisfaction, and those responses that are not followed by satisfaction are not reinforced, are not learned. That is the first law that Thorndike formulated, how human beings learn. Notice what he is saying is that there is no conscious effort involved in learning of a cat. He is saying simply that the cat learned those responses that led to satisfaction, that created satisfaction, and did not learn those responses that did not lead to satisfaction. So, from a point of view of a functionalist, he would not be considered a functionalist, because Thorndike is not talking about functions here. Thorndike is just looking at the behavior of the cat and the relationship of learning with reinforcement. Notice the connection between Thorndike's law of effect and Pavlovian law of conditioning. Pavlov had said that we learn because of process of conditioning, and that is dependent upon reinforcement. And Thorndike is saying, had showed the same thing. Pavlov was using his dogs and salivation response, and here is Thorndike using cats and their behavior of satisfying themselves. That was his first law then, the law of effect. The second law that he enumerated of learning was what he called the law of exercise. That when you or when an animal repeats a pattern of behavior, repetition helps to stamp in the act or learning into the organism. आपकी memory थोड़ी सी jog करूं मैं इस मामले में. William James, the functionalist, had said that mere repetition of acts creates habits. And Thorndike is saying the same thing, that by repeating acts, by repetition, learning takes place. मैंने आपको पिछली दफे भी बताया था that you could develop a habit by repeating an act, a pattern of behavior. Similarly, you could unlearn a habit by not repeating a pattern of behavior. यही बात हमें विलियम जेम्स ने कही है और यही बात थॉर्नडाइक कह रहा है in terms of his law of exercise. The law of exercise, Thorndike says, is learning by repeating an act again and again. इसको अगर आप अपनी रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी पे अप्लाई करें तो आप देखिए आपको इसका कितना फायदा हो सकता है. मिसाल के तौर पर मैंने पहले भी आपसे कहा था, किसी शख्स को एक बुरी आदत है सिगरेट पीने की और वो चाहता है कि वो सिगरेट की आदत खत्म कर दे. तो विलियम जेम्स और थॉर्नडाइक क्या कह रहे हैं कि हैबिट जो है वो रेपिटेशन से बनी है. लॉ ऑफ इफेक्ट एंड द लॉ ऑफ एक्सरसाइज आर ऑपरेटिव, particularly the law of exercise in case of a smoker. He is repeating the act again and again. And how can the habit be broken? In Thorndike's terminology of law of exercise, by not practicing that behavior. What he has learned is the behavior of smoking by repeating that behavior, and what he can unlearn is by stopping to repeat that behavior. Of course, initially it might be difficult because smoking is followed by satisfaction and one is seeking that satisfaction. But if one can exercise control over one's desire for this satisfaction of a cigarette, then one can conquer the habit also. I beseech you, I ask you not to give in to the bad habit of smoking. And if you follow James's point of view, and if you follow the experiments that Thorndike conducted and showed that learning takes place as a function of law of effect, and that we can control that habit by law of exercise. And that is how we can go ahead and break bad habits, and that is how we can go ahead and inculcate good habits. Thorndike also talks about the law of recency or the recency effect. Actually, it's a recency effect rather than a law. And what is the recency effect? In Thorndike's point of view, the recency effect is that the last act in a series of actions is learned quickly. The last action in a series of acts is learned quickly. That is the recency effect. That last act which has been reinforced or which creates satisfaction, which is followed by satisfaction, is learned, and less recent acts are not learned that quickly. मसलन अगर बिल्ली ने अपने कान को प्रिक किया है और फिर उसने लीवर पे पंजा मारा है और उस वजह से दरवाज़ा खुला और बिल्ली को दूध या फूड मिल गया, तो रिसेंट एक्ट इनमें दोनों में कौन सा है? कान को प्रिक करना नहीं, बल्कि पॉज से ताले को या लैच को खोलना. तो रीसेंसी इफेक्ट जिसको थॉर्नडाइक कह रहा है वो ये है कि इन दोनों में से जो ज्यादा नजदीक है सेटिस्फैक्शन के वो जल्दी याद हो जाएगा, और जो सेटिस्फैक्शन से दूर है, पहले है, पीछे है, वो याद नहीं होगा, वो उसको याद होने में या लर्न करने में देर लगेगी. So recency effect relates to the learning of the response, which is quickly followed by reinforcement. Thorndike's position remained the same for a number of years after he had worked on his puzzle box. But near the end of his career, he repealed and modified both these laws that he formulated, the law of effect and the law of, बताइए कौन सा law है वो दूसरा, सोच लिया, and the law of exercise. By his experimentation, as you can see on your screens also, by his experimentation and observation, he repealed and modified these two laws and proposed a new law that he called the law of belongingness to explain animal learning. And what is this law of belongingness that he is talking about? That the natural and relevant responses that belong to a learning situation are learned. That natural and relevant responses that belong to the learning situation are learned, others are stamped out. मैंने अभी आपको बताया, the pricking of the ear by the cat is not learned, the pawing of the lever or the latch is learned. And that is what is called the law of belongingness. Now, since Thorndike had been talking about not consciousness but the behavior of animals, since Thorndike had shown that learning takes place, that animals learn as a function of laws that he had enumerated, therefore he is called a behaviorist. He could be included as an early behaviorist. He did not call himself a behaviorist, unlike other people who did call them behaviorists who came afterwards. But since Thorndike concentrated upon analyzing the behavior of animals, and since he did not assume any functions of consciousness that may have been involved in learning, that is why later historians have included Edward Thorndike as one of the prominent early behaviorists. Let us recapture what we have talked about today. Before we end today's lecture, we started with the contributions of an early behaviorist. We talked about why this concept of behaviorism or behaviorists became relevant. I had pointed out that as a result of tremendous growth in the industrial potential of European and American continents, the need for control, prediction of human behavior had become very important. Psychologists were therefore more prone to discovering what are the operative laws that control and determine human behavior. And human behavior can be studied in simplistic terms in animal behavior. And that is why we see this stress or this emergence of what is called experimentation on animals. Although, if you remember, the pioneer for that experimentation was Pavlov. And in between Pavlov and Thorndike, we had practically no important, prominent psychologist working on animals. After Pavlov, we have in the American continent an important or a prominent comparative psychologist or somebody who started to work with animals to understand the process of learning. The aim was to be able to shed light on human behavior, particularly in this context, human learning. And based upon his experiments, Thorndike's experiments, he formulated what he called the laws of learning. And those laws of learning were, do you remember what? Those laws of learning were law of effect and law of exercise. And then the law of effect and the law of exercise were modified and repealed, and there emerged this what he called the law of belongingness. And law of belongingness was that relevant responses are learned, irrelevant are stamped out, are unlearned. Now compare Thorndike and Pavlov, and you would see that Thorndike is almost always saying the same thing that Pavlov had been saying. And Pavlov had said that conditioning takes place because of reinforcement. And what is reinforcement? Reinforcement is a kind of satisfaction that the organism gets by performing an act. And what is Thorndike saying? Thorndike is saying that the law of effect operates. And what is the law of effect? Those things, Thorndike says, are learned which are followed by satisfaction. You see the connection between these two great psychologists, Thorndike and Pavlov. Number one, both working on animals. Number two, both discovering laws of how animals learn. And number three, both talking about satisfaction on the part of the organism as an important variable, in learning. So you can see the direct line that Thorndike is following from Pavlovian point of view. Thorndike is considered one of the earlier behaviorists. We will talk about other behaviorists in the next few lectures, and there's a host of very important behaviorists that we'll talk about. For the time being, keep revising what we had done so far. Revision would help you with remembering and sharpening your memory. And until the next time, Khuda Hafiz, God be with you.